Hallo und willkommen zu einer neuen Folge des Tech- und Community-Podcasts. In der heutigen Episode ist Greg Taylor zu Gast und ich spreche mit ihm über die Abschaltung der Exchange Web Services in Exchange Online. Aber genug der Vorrede. Greg, it's a pleasure to have you as a guest in my podcast again. Can you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Thomas. Pleasure to be here as well. Greg Taylor, I'm a principal product manager in Microsoft 365 Core, which means I kind of work to a large degree on our what you might think of Exchange platform and product, and I run the Exchange programmability team.
Programmability team. That sounds exciting.
Well, yeah, it's think of you want to write an application that talks to Exchange or the data that's stored within Exchange, then my team kind of owns those client-facing protocols. So think of things like Graph API for mail and EWS and POP and IMAP and ActiveSync and all of those things.
So so before we start switching over to EWS, so it's more or less like all the API endpoints that are responsible for reading and writing all the stuff in this fancy folder structure within a mailbox that is not accessible by Outlook directly, more or less.
Yeah,
so to speak.
yeah, pretty much. Yeah, all the sort of client connectivity protocols. But even it includes stuff that Outlook uses too, because Outlook is Outlook connects and accesses stuff in your mailbox as well. So kind of my team, and it's kind of, I would say it's kind of interesting because the way I think most people think of Exchange as a product, Exchange Online or Exchange on-prem, certainly the way we build and engineer it these days, there is no Exchange team as such inside Microsoft. There is, you'll find that there's a mail team and a calendar team and a task team. There's a whole bunch of different teams. So it's a little bit of a matrixed organization these days.
There's quite a change over the years. But so last time we spoke about the deprecation of basic auth in Exchange Online. So it has been a while. Did the deprecation went as smoothly as expected?
I'm delighted to hear you say that. I think from my perspective, it went pretty well. It went very well, actually. I'm really happy. Towards the end, we were turning off basic auth in an awful lot of tenants every night. We were turning off. At one point, we were turning off 1 million tenants, kind of within 24, 48 hours. Now, a lot of those, obviously, don't necessarily have active customers in them, because there are many test tenants and demo tenants and abandoned tenants, right? But the goal was always to try and turn off basic auth without causing mayhem and chaos. And I think we achieved that. Certainly some customers probably might disagree because they were surprised.
Yeah, I bet they were.
But we also, we kind of accounted for that by building in the sort of self-help thing. We use the self-help diagnostic tools in the admin center so that when we turn something off, a customer could go and turn it back on again and get themselves a little extra time. And so we're going to use something similar again for EWS because, despite us telling customers they should keep up to date with all of our news and understand all of our dates, I personally am a bit of a realist. I realize that it's difficult. Microsoft puts out a lot of information, a lot of dates, a lot of, most people who work in this space, they have a lot to do. And so tracking every possible thing that Microsoft might be doing at any point in time is hard. So it's just a balance. But no, I think it went well. So I was happy with how things turned out for sure.
Hey, that's really good. So the next venture in securing Exchange Online or the Exchange Online estate is the deprecation of Exchange Web Services. So
yes.
My pretty simple question is, why does Microsoft deprecate EWS and Exchange Online?
Good question. So we actually started this. I'll sort of come at the question. I'll do the history first. We started this, I would say, probably 5 years ago, and at the time, I would say it probably was just a more of a desire to try and push people to Graph API and modernize the stack. And then what really changed things for us was, I'm going to say 18 months ago, roughly, well, depending on when you listen to this, end of 23, let's just say, we became aware of kind of compromises and issues within our own infrastructure, which we've been blogged about. And I'm sure you've got a link, somewhere if people want to read about the events of what happened around that time, where we had some issues with some compromise, and EWS was one of the things that was leveraged. It wasn't the entry point into which anything came into Microsoft, but once the attacker had the ability to do whatever they kind of wanted to do, EWS was something that they used to read everybody's email, essentially. Right? So EWS has a very simplistic permissions model because it was designed 20 years ago, which is one permission. And if you have that permission, you can use EWS to read everything in a user's mailbox. And if you have that permission across the entire, or if you can act as an application and have that, then you can read everybody's email. And so what happened was it became pretty clear that this is not quite going to stand the modern scrutiny. We needed to start getting rid of EWS. So we needed to accelerate and expand the scope of EWS, because the other aspect here was, so to answer your question, it's all about security. No question, it's all about security. It's entirely security driven. But what happened as a result of that was we added our own applications to the deprecation, because we previously had said it was only third-party applications or non-Microsoft applications that had to stop using EWS. And then what this meant was we decided that we had to get our own applications off EWS, and that's what we've been really busy doing for the last year. Really busy.
Yeah. There are quite a number of let's say first-party application, as you name it, right? So,
Yeah.
right.
So that means the first-party applications that you all know, like so Outlook. Right? Outlook uses EWS. Historically, it's always used EWS. It's used EWS for free busy lookups and mail tips and out of office and a whole bunch of stuff. Now, the Outlook team had already been working on moving those things over to non-EWS. I'm going to say REST, because we'll get into a little into the mechanics of it. But Exchange Online, Exchange, if you like, has a REST endpoint, which is published through the Graph API. And so, the Outlook team are calling the REST endpoint directly rather than through Graph API. There's a number of reasons for that. But so if you think about it from a Microsoft app perspective, you have very obvious client-facing apps like Outlook. Teams used to use EWS, still does in some scenarios. Dynamics uses EWS in some scenarios. But what most people wouldn't see and appreciate is that there's an awful lot of underlying background apps and services that use EWS as well. And
Yeah, right.
they're the ones that are really quite challenging, because if you know Exchange, you'll know there's this idea of redirection and proxy. There's proxying of EWS requests from server to server, right? And there's also things like what we call the calendar repairer system and email lifecycle management. And all of these things use EWS because it's a great multi-purpose protocol for getting stuff done with Exchange. And so all of these teams who, and I mean, the number of requests per day from something like the calendar repairer system is just phenomenal. It's kind of crazy transactional numbers. And they've been busy working on how they're going to stop using EWS and move to something else inside our own data center. So it's not traffic you ever see at the client side or on a customer, on any kind of install that you have, but server to server and background services within our own data center. It's one of the busiest applications, fixing everybody's calendar up. fixing the attendee list, telling you who's accepted and who's declined, and blah, 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 all of that kind of stuff causes an enormous amount of traffic. So all of that has to come off EWS as well. And our goal is to do all of this by around the middle of this year. So we are quite close, which is 2025. So the middle of 2025, I'm hoping we'll have very little EWS usage by Microsoft applications.
Oh, well, that's pretty interesting. So, so you mentioned that the overall, let's say, start for the deprecation of EWS already started a few years ago.
Yes.
Yeah. And I do remember that one of the, and primarily to push people using or moving away from EWS towards the MS Graph API, as you mentioned. But I do remember that one of the, let's say, or name it a complaints were the lack of a feature comparison between the EWS functionality and the Graph API. So what is your state on the
gaps? Yeah,
the gaps. Yeah, mind the gap, right? Yeah.
There are still some gaps. There are less than there were, but there are still some gaps. And my team own the responsibility for trying to get those filled. Now, what I would say is quite a few things on this. There are definitely some. So let's just take, the one that we hear about a lot is Graph API access to the in-place archive, or exchange management tasks over the Graph API, because you can do some of those in EWS, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a couple of good ones. So in-place archive through the Graph API is currently in development. Exchange management APIs, we are finally working on moving exchange management APIs to the Graph API. So again, I'd say in development. The challenge, I'll say though, is timing. I'm not going to beat around the bush and say it's all coming out next week, because it's not. But we are constantly trying to solve and fill those gaps. Now that said, there's an awful lot you can do today with Graph API that you can do in EWS, and there's an awful lot of applications that could be migrated to Graph API today without any waiting or hesitation. There are email apps built on the Graph API today that are not using any of the things that we're missing. So there are very successful functional applications using nothing but Graph API. So, and then we've also recently released a new thing as well. So I can talk, I'll briefly talk about that. So in May this year, in 2025 May, we just released an EWS code analyzer, which will, and I actually saw, Tom, you were one of the first people who commented, I think, on the GitHub page or something. I think I saw your alias there, one of the first people, right? So
yeah, right, because the code analyzer wasn't mentioned in in the blog post mentioning the EWS report that is now finally available in the 10 to see or to identify the applications generating EWS traffic. And to be honest, when I took a first look into the now in production available report, it more or less ripped away the cover, and it provided so much visibility to application that I, to be honest, wasn't necessarily aware of. So hunting down the app IDs was quite some fun.
So there's several things that we've just literally in the last week have come out with. So the admin reports that you mentioned, right? And then the code analyzer, and also so let's talk about those in turn. So the admin reports, first of all, you're right that the report that shows a tenant admin what their EWS usage looks like. It surfaces the app ID, the SOAP action or the request, and the number of requests that it made. So we've got a couple of improvements coming to that. And literally before we're talking now, I was on a call with Berth on the team, who's the PM for that fantastic report that got it out. We were talking about what comes next, and there's several improvements we plan on making. We're going to make the report hopefully have daily data rather than weekly data in the coming months. And then the next most important piece is how we're going to get the app name surfaced. And it sounds like an easy problem to fix. And if it was that easy, we would have had it in the first iteration, I promise. It's slightly more complicated in the background, but we are working to try and get the app name so you can easily resolve the name. Because none of us are particularly good at working with app IDs, although I have reached the point, sadly, where I actually recognize app IDs for certain apps without having to know the name, because that is how tragic my life is when I work on this stuff. So the admin reports, great. Now they're only available in the worldwide cloud. We're not making them available currently in other clouds, and simply that comes down to two things, which is there's a lot of infrastructure required to publish a report like that into a cloud, into one of our environments. There's a lot of back-end infrastructure and a bunch of pipelines and a whole bunch of compliance and security. And then to roll that into some of our other clouds, by that I mean the GCC, High, and DoD, and I don't know, all the others, right? Trust me, the complexity goes up dramatically. And the usage of EWS in some of those clouds isn't as great. So it kind of is not really it's not an easy decision to make. It's very expensive to do and not terribly beneficial. So what we did was we looked at what alternatives we could do for people in those environments, and that's what was the other aspect of what we released last week, which would be a set of code that would pull essentially the same data, including the app name this time, because that can be done client side from a script rather than server side for the report. So in fact, there is if you really want to pull the same data, we can get all the app names. You can actually use the script and the tools that we published in addition to the report. And then the other thing we published as well, which is this code analyzer, is an add-in, Visual Studio add-in, that will then take your EWS code, look at the methods that are being used or the SOAP actions that are being called, do a parity check against where our current parity, it goes back to your original question, goes back, looks at the code, looks at what's possible to do in Graph, and will call out where parity exists or where it doesn't. And then it will neatly help with a bit of GitHub Copilot help, will help you refactor and rewrite code to use Graph. So we literally are providing tools so admins and developers can now see what the EWS apps in their environment are, what SOAP actions or actions they're taking, analyze the code by putting it in with our code analyzer, and then starting to generate code to move it to the Graph API.
Okay,
so we did it. We've been busy.
Yeah, right. But it's definitely a helpful tool, and I definitely would say that if you as a company currently develop or have self-developed EWS applications in your store, you should definitely start trying or seeing to adjust it today and not wait, until whatever comes down the road this year, late summer or fall over. Because it takes time.
It does take time, right? And even if you know today that you need in-place archive access through Graph, and your application uses that, sure, great. We haven't shipped that yet, I admit, but there's probably an awful lot of other functionality your application is using, and it's not like you're going to just switch the application from EWS to Graph overnight. You could start a transition process, get moving, making progress, because then when the functionality we know is missing starts to arrive, you're much further along that development process than you would be if you waited. I mean, that's pretty logical, and so Well, I do. I would definitely encourage anyone who has EWS apps, if they are in-house, get the developers to start looking at this and working on it if they're not already. And if you have partner apps, if you have apps from, companies you buy software from or whatever it may be, start asking them the really hard question: when are you going to have a Graph API version of this? Because Microsoft are going to turn it off in October 2026, right? And if they have no idea that's going to happen, good thing you told them.
Yeah, I already, I have those little voices right in my ear, telling me, oh, it's just 1 year, so it's too short. This is short time span, for adjusting all of our code. Well, this is something that we heard, in the past, like, when the deprecation of basic OS happened, it was very much the same.
I mean, we had to delay. We delayed basic auth by, I think I pushed the date out maybe by a year after we'd announced it, right? And so, because basically, we announced it and everyone went, "Whoa, no, that's terrible," and then did absolutely nothing, right? And so with EWS though, we've been sending this message for 5 years that this is happening, and of course, many companies have done nothing. But given what we talked about at the beginning and why we're doing this, I'm going to just say that the likelihood of us pushing this out is close to zero. We are going to hold a firm line on this one, which means that I think people should start working on this today if they're not already
working. Right, I totally get the point, but the things that are customers. So there's multiple moving parts in regards to exchange and exchange functionality at the time. So we are approaching the subscription edition. We are approaching the replacement of the shared service principle, the deprecation of EWS next year, and there are quite a number of customers who mentioned to me, yeah, all these dates that Microsoft announced, they're going to push it anyway. I say, okay, I wouldn't, take any stance on this. Just, take the time or the dates as stated and act upon.
I think, listen, I've been at Microsoft. I just had my 20-year anniversary at Microsoft. I can barely believe it, right? But and so I have first-hand experience of how we have pushed dates historically. I've been around here long enough to know that dates were always something that was somewhat adjustable. I'm just going to say I think that's changed. We're moving a lot faster than we ever used to. Trust me, I am under pressure to do things as quickly as possible. I mean, there was to give you an example, the application impersonation, the RBAC app impersonation thing in Exchange that we turned off earlier this year, right? This was also something that was highlighted as a big security risk as a result of the incidents 18 months ago. When all of that happened, I was on calls with some of our senior leadership where I was told, just turn it off tomorrow. Just like literally turn this thing off. And I argued and had to push back for the impact, and the number of customers that would have applications that would simply stop working would be very high, and it would be very disruptive. And I managed to talk them away from that and get a reasonable time frame, which was probably for some customers still not long enough, but it never is, right? What I'm trying to say is, I think our willingness to be flexible on dates has decreased over time, particularly when it's security focused. We really don't want our customers' data to be at risk because of something that we knew, understood, or they didn't deploy. So, you take that, the other one you mentioned, which is the shared security principle stuff, right, that we've recently announced. So basically that's Exchange Hybrid. So the on-prem Exchange server is going to have to use a unique app ID and application to call into Exchange Online rather than the shared principle of Exchange Online. Again, this is a security-driven thing. Now, I'll be quite direct here, which is I think we've given customers too long to implement it. We've told them they have 6 months to implement it.
Yeah, which drives them crazy to,
Well, and honestly, I mean, literally, I was telling the team just yesterday, like, I think that's way too long. I think customers should do it like right away. It's like a security thing, and so I do appreciate, and I did say this earlier. Microsoft puts out tons of stuff, and we expect admins and customers to ignore everything else and just focus on the things that we individually care about. I know that's hard, but security stuff like this really can't be ignored, and it has to be prioritized because the consequence of not doing some of this stuff is pretty dramatic. And we don't want customers to be on the front page news of a paper because of some known vulnerability or some issue that we've told them that they should fix and they didn't.
totally agreed. But this is a thinking that is not only unique for the M365 team, so to speak, because when you take a look at the message center posts, you definitely see that each and every team thinks in this way, that their change or their changes announced, are more important than the other from other teams. So it's quite overwhelming to consume all the message center posts or the stuff that is happening on a single day, in a single week, and not even thinking about a month.
Man,
Right.
I totally agree, right? And I say this internally to folks as well, which is I think we sometimes over communicate through things like Message Center, and like when I open up a test tenant, if I spin up a test tenant and I open up the Message Center, it's like, oh my God, what am I supposed to do with all of this information? Now, I think we need to filter it down to stuff that's important versus stuff that's informational. And I know we do, and we prioritize. There are definitely categories that will help you determine what's important. But you have to be pretty familiar with how our stuff operates, and in order to really know what for yourself what you should address immediately, what can be put off, and whatever else. Right? I mean, ultimately, the goal for us should be to make it as simple as possible for customers to be secure. Right? That's that's the goal. And that's an ever sort of, that's a never ending assignment, right? We every time we try and make steps in that space, there'll be some new problem or new issue. But we are continually trying. There's some other things I'm involved in right now, which is we're trying to make it, we're trying to simplify securing the tenant as much as we can. But Thomas, you're quite right. I mean, Message Center is the official path for communication for this kind of stuff. And I urge customers to try and put up with the noise and work through it and figure out what they really need to be doing.
Yeah. So in regards to the deprecation of the shared, so the switch or the switch over from the shared service principle to a dedicated registered app. So what are the implications for on-premises Exchange Server in that regard?
Well, for that change specifically, I mean, I don't think there's any. Well, it's step one of two things, right? So for Exchange on-prem / hybrid customers, there are really two changes related to the area that I care about, which so the first is this switch over to a private or a unique service principle from the shared principle. And I mean, apart from that, there shouldn't be any functionality change. Everything should just carry on. It's a process that happens as you go through, and there are a few steps to go through it, but they should be pretty straightforward. The end goal, the second phase, is the moving of outbound requests from Exchange on-prem to cloud to start using Graph API rather than EWS, because we're closing down EWS in Exchange Online, as we have mentioned before. In case anyone's not clear on that. But it actually does make for a rather bizarre situation in that we're not removing EWS from Exchange on-prem. So what it means is, I know and listen, the irony of this is not lost on me, that EWS will be used when on Exchange Online has to call Exchange on-prem to get FreeBusy, but Graph API will be used in the other direction. So it is not I know.
So, so I think this is now definitely the point where we definitely should state, okay, there is a October 2025 is the goal for having done the switch from moving from a shared service principle over to a dedicated app. And then there's October 2026, where you start the deprecation for EWS, down your global Office 365 offering.
Yes. So yeah, that's right, and so and also I'll tell you, if internally as well, the timeline I'm working to is we intend blocking EWS in our own Microsoft tenant in July this year. July, which is not far away.
Yeah.
Now there may be when we do that a couple of exceptions that will run for a little extra time while we just work through the final pieces. But we're actually planning on what we call a screen test inside the Microsoft tenant in the next couple of weeks, where we're going to block EWS. I already have EWS turned off on my mailbox, right? And so the way I'll just share it, right? So EWS was turned off on my mailbox probably 6 weeks ago. The only noticeable thing for me right now is I don't see mail tips in Outlook. Right, that doesn't work. But Outlook for me is already using REST for everything else, for the stuff that traditionally used AWS for. Yeah, go on.
So in that regard, I do have to ask, which type of Outlook app you're using, Outlook Classic on your Outlook, or just Outlook as we say today.
I'm using Outlook Classic, if you want to call it that, the Win32 version.
Just to have an impression,
Yeah. No, because new Outlook does not use EWS at all. So I'm using Classic Outlook, so I can understand what the impact of turning EWS off is. And right now, all it means for me is I can't get mail tips. So I don't know when I'm sending a mail to a person who's outside my organization. But I generally do know when I'm sending email to people outside my organization. So I don't find that one terribly disruptive. Although saying that, there has been one occasion recently where I did include an external recipient on an email. So maybe mail tips could have saved me on that occasion. But anyway, but EWS is disabled on my mailbox, but all of the underlying service code that I talked about earlier, calendar repair, ELC, which is the agent or the mailbox assistant that moves stuff from primary to archive mailboxes and stuff, all of that continues to function even when EWS is disabled on my mailbox, because essentially it's service code, not client code. So what we plan on doing. So I'm just going to think. So think about the way we're going to block EWS for customers in October 2026 is we're going to turn the tenant-wide EWS-enabled switch to false. This is a flag that we recently made some changes in, and a couple of people on the blog were a little upset about us changing the tenant
behavior.
Yeah. So basically,
Mhm.
The old behavior was the tenant could have it set to disabled, but the user had it set to enabled, and therefore it worked. And I get that we have that same functionality in a few other places too, like transport, right? I understand that. However, we don't want to use it that way. We want the tenant-wide switch to be the overall kill switch for EWS. And simply that's because when we go starting to turn that bit in October 2026, we want EWS to be truly disabled in a tenant and not overridden on the user basis. So we had to change the logic. And I will tell you that we had a small number of people on the blog comment, and I appreciate that they were upset and didn't like what we did, but it was very fixable. But I'll also tell you that there were about 10 support cases overall in the world on this issue,
That's not too much.
which is not a lot, right? And all of them, all of them, I appreciate they all had to go through the process and they had some disruption, but we had message center posted this change, we had blogged this change, we had provided all the necessary information to do the workaround. They didn't see any of that. They called support. They ended up getting resolution. But anyway, what we are going to do once all of our own internal services and applications are off EWS, so the calendar repair, the ELC thing, these are two, there are more examples, but they're internal code that nobody really cares about. But well, they will if they stop working. Trust me, they don't care then, right? But these are things that we're working with teams to resolve. And so, once all of those teams have got their code off EWS, we will then go and make further changes to the EWS-enabled tenant-wide block, so that that switch means no EWS traffic is allowed in the tenant, whether it's user traffic from Outlook or an application, or whether it's a background app or service, whatever it is. EWS enabled false will truly mean for a tenant there is no EWS being used in the tenant. So that change will be invisible to customers, but it's a pretty big change from our perspective because it means that EWS is truly turned off in the tenant. And so our goal is to do that in our own tenant in the coming months, so that later in the year we're able to say to customers with confidence, if you want to turn EWS enabled, the tenant-wide switch, to false, you will truly be blocking EWS in your tenant. That's our goal.
Okay, so just before wrapping up, there's one thing that I always have to think of is the upcoming end of support for the Exchange over 2016 and 2019. So both versions received a hotfix update for being able to create the dedicated app registration, so that those two versions are, can move away from the shared service principle over to an app ID. And as far as I remember, the blog post stated that sometime mid-year, late summer, whatever, without a date, there will be the option to switch over from using EWS for hybrid connectivity over to the Graph API. So this will be available for those versions
Yes.
as well. Okay.
That's right. So now I say that, but the exact version numbers, which version it's coming for, I'm not sure. I think you're quite right in what you said, absolutely. But I would urge just read the blog to be 100%.
Right. So you should stay with the most current build anyway.
Yeah, absolutely, always, right? And I mean, we say that jokingly, but you really should, right? And particularly keep up to date with security patches and everything as well. The move. So that on-prem uses Graph when calling into the Exchange Online tenant, the move to REST or Graph from EWS is very much so that a customer can again disable EWS at the tenant level if they don't want to have EWS enabled in their tenant, but they are hybrid. They can then start using the Graph API to call into Exchange line, and then they can disable EWS in their online tenant entirely with a single switch. That will be the goal. That is the goal. And so this will be before the end of the year. We'll be in that position where EWS at the tenant-wide level being set to false truly blocks EWS, and yet all of your Microsoft applications, including your on-prem servers, can carry on working without interruption. So then you're left with, and I say it flippantly perhaps, but then you're left with just the third-party applications that use EWS. And that's the only reason you need EWS. Now, I'm not underestimating the work required for those. And there are some heavy-hitting applications that use EWS. Backup vendors, there's a lot of backup vendors using EWS to extract data from Exchange. Well, we have Graph APIs for all of that, so that's something that should be switching over to Graph API. We have a number of big, security-focused products that scan mailboxes using EWS, and a lot of that can be moved to Graph API. There are challenges. Some of them are we're talking to some of them about around throttling and scalability and stuff, but those are issues that we think we'll work through. And I'll say as well, one of the biggest EWS consumers is the Mac Mail and Calendar and Contact apps on Mac, not on iOS. So iPads and iPhones use ActiveSync, but Mac OS uses EWS. So we're working very closely with Apple on the migration of their applications to the Graph API. I'll tell you that. There's a very big consumer. So if you have people using Mac and the native mail apps, calendar, contacts, and everything inside your org, they're using EWS. Mac Outlook doesn't use EWS, by the way. Just saying. But Mac does. So yeah, there's a bit to do, but I feel like we're making some good progress at the moment. We've very much been focusing on all the Microsoft applications for the past 6 to 9 months, and we're close to the end of that. We're now going to re-pivot and focus our attention on external customers and partners, which is why all of the admin reports and the code analyzer and everything else has been released in the past few weeks. So looking forward to getting into that with lots of partners and customers.
Awesome. So, Greg, thanks for stopping by and for sharing all the valuable information about the deprecation of Exchange Web Services and Exchange Online. And I look forward to having you on the show for whatever kind of deprecations coming down the road in the future.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Thanks, Thomas.
Ja, das war es dann auch rund um die Abschaltung der Exchange Web Services in Exchange Online. Alle wichtigen Links zu den Blogartikeln, die über die Zeit veröffentlicht wurden von dem lieben Team von Microsoft 365 für Messaging, findet ihr im Blogartikel zu dieser Episode. Danke, dass ihr zugehört habt und ja, bis zum nächsten Mal. Ciao.